Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Tuesday, May 19th, 2026. I'm John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Senior editor Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John.
Social commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
And joining us today, our old colleague, senior editor at National Review and the author of Published Today, out today, May 19th, his long-awaited book, Blood and Progress, Noah Rothman. Hi, Noah.
Hi, John.
So I should say that Blood and Progress originated as an article in Commentary 2 years ago, and your subtitle is...
A century of left-wing violence in America. And the president tells us last night that this is the only thing that's going to happen today. There will be no world historic events that interrupt the rollout of Blood and Progress.
Yeah. So what's important is that, yes, Donald Trump has postponed the war in Iran so that Noah could get a free shot at an open pub day for Blood and Progress. And Trump is not the only person conspiring to give Noah's book a boost because yesterday, outside the courtroom in New York City, where the judge hearing the case of accused murderer Luigi Mangione, the accused assassin of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson, some controversial rulings yesterday by the judge in that case, but outside the courtroom, oddly credentialed by the press office of Zohran Mamdani, were three young women who then gave an impromptu press conference by themselves that it itself justifies the publication and indeed the place at the top of the bestseller list of Noah Rothman's Blood and Progress. So let me just quote what they said. Ashley Rojas, who has some kind of weird analog place in the new media, said this, quote, F, but she didn't say F, Brian Thompson. That's all I want to say. F Brian Thompson, F his mom. This is a man who was shot in the back on the street in New York at 6:45 in the morning on 53rd Street, dead. So F him and F his mom, apparently, who somehow has multi-generational evil in her DNA. Her colleague in this press conference, one Lena Weisbrot, added, his children are better off without him. They need to learn to not be like their dad and enjoy the blood money, kids. He's responsible for more deaths than Osama bin Laden. And I remember Americans celebrating when Osama bin Laden was killed. It's not like we don't understand heroic violence or like when violence is good. So this story emerges as the judge is hearing the evidence and trying to rule inadmissible or admissible the evidence in the Brian Thompson case. Noah, this does seem to be exhibit A in your argument about how political violence has crossed from being an occasional or very odd thing in American life in the last decade to becoming something with which we are all too distressingly and commonly familiar.
Yeah, well, it certainly justifies the opening of the first chapter of the book with the slaying of Brian Thompson, and more poignantly, the reaction to it, which featured a half dozen members of Congress condemning murder, but also understanding where human sacrifice comes from and the desirability of it from the perspective of those who would celebrate it. It justifies exploring the degree to which Mangione's name was cheered on Saturday Night Live, that in-demand merchandise was sold with the manic musings that he scratched onto the bullet casings that he fired, into Brian Thompson's back, the blasphemously brought blasphemous prayer candles with his face etched on them, and the degree to which far too many Americans subordinated all discretion, all civic propriety to celebrate murder because it channeled in them something cathartic. And it's hardly the first episode. It's probably not going to be the last. And it sets up the exploration of the last 5 to 7 years of left-wing violence, manic lone gunmen, riotous mobs that descend on American urban centers nightly, sophisticated ambush tactics deployed against ICE and CBP facilities by small cell terrorist groups. This is what we're facing today. And looking it square in the face is what I hope this book achieves.
So, of course, the first objection to an argument like yours is the what about objection, which is, well, isn't there a lot of political violence on the right? Why are you focusing your ire on the left? That would seem to be an effort to excuse problems within your own conservative camp and lay them at the feet of the camp that you are not ideologically a part of. So how do you answer that objection?
So, yeah, that takes on the quality of an excuse when it's deployed with the frequency that it is being deployed to counter the evidence of our own eyes, which is we're increasingly confronted with episodes of left-wing violence. But I'm very suspicious of, I don't call them out for being completely wrong, but there's quite a few databases that purport to claim, using statistical evidence, that the right is the font from which all domestic political violence springs. And if you dig into the actual individual cases that support that narrative based on these data sets, you see gang violence, intra-family violence, prison violence, episodes in which somebody graffitied the side of a church and that's coded as right-wing violence, episodes in which a homeless man walked into a hotel and started hurling racial slurs at the hotelier. That's right-wing violence. So you start to get a little suspicious of the conclusions that are supposedly justified by these data sets. I don't counter them with my own data set. I think the whole enterprise is subjective and fraught. Nevertheless, I try to explore these as individual episodes, identify the manic thought process that leads in which, to some extent, is you see it across the board. Somebody who engages in violence in the pursuit of policy outcomes is, in some degree, succumbing to disordered thinking. So you do have to explore them on an individual level. And then, also in the first chapter, I cite pretty extensively a report that was prepared for the Department of Homeland Security by this organization, Insight. And in it, they describe the degree to which researchers who study violent left-wing extremism face intimidation campaigns, loss of professional reputation, social isolation, even the threat of physical retribution for doing their work, to say nothing of the fact that quite a lot of the study of left-wing extremism is conducted by individuals who are members of the organizations and groups that are accused of engaging in extremist tactics and left-wing violence. So the whole enterprise is kind of fraught when you start to look into it. And I'm not saying that, I'm not pointing the finger at the left and saying, well, you're more violent than the right. I find that to be a childish argument. The two phenomena are intertwined. They're reciprocal. They feed on one another. And to look at one side of this equation at the expense of the other is to fail to comprehend the problem. You don't understand its contours or scope, and we certainly can't wrap our hands around. We can't address it if we don't acknowledge its full scope.
So this is actually why I think your excellent book, which I demanded an advance copy of and got, so I'm halfway through. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
One of the things that really struck me about it that's important is because I do think there'll be a mainstream media attempt to do just that, to do the whataboutism about this argument. And I think what's important is it's not just a numbers game, who's more violent than the other. You're right, that's absolutely the wrong argument. But that our culture has long supported, winked at, sort of nodded approvingly in private with fellow travelers, the idea that the left-wing causes justify a little bit of violence. And that's where I think we see what was interesting to me about yesterday's sidewalk display by the journalist, so-called journalist that John described, is that the lawyer for Mangione instantly released a statement saying, no, we're pleading not guilty. Let's not have these people out there justifying his cause. So I do think that the mainstream culture's acceptance, glorification, certainly in popular culture, it's elevation of the idea of left-wing violence being pure, being revolutionary, all these things that code good, is a huge part of the problem. And I think your book does an excellent job just through power of narrative and the stories you tell and what you're showing, that has always been a lie, and that people on the right have long pointed to that. But the rest of the culture needs to catch up and understand that going forward, we're going to have a bigger problem if we don't understand that at core, this is not revolutionary justice being meted out. It is murder.
Abe, Abe, you were yeah, go
Can I
ahead.
just mention on that point about the what those women said yesterday about Brian Thompson? The fact that they felt so comfortable, unapologetically reveling, not only in his death, in the misery of his family over it. The point, and I'm not someone who, obviously, I don't believe speech is violence, and I don't believe in hate speech laws, but the point of that speech was to wound. It was as if they could enact some further violence, they would have. And the fact that they felt so comfortable spitting it out, making a show of this ugliness, I think really speaks to, and there's a lot of this on the left too. This is I mean on the right too. This is another sort of area in which they feed off each other's. It's a sort of arms war of ugly rhetoric. Something has gone wrong on the social level as well. It's not just political, ideological. There is a component here having to do with just how you're supposed to interact in a world, in space that you have to share with other human beings.
Look, part of this is these two things are intrinsically related. If Luigi Mangione, we don't know what, he had disordered thinking and all of that. If somebody like that would think that the world would believe him to be one of the great villains in history, that might be the sort of thing that could retard, even a disordered thinking person, that might retard him justifying to himself his own bloodlust and going at Brian Thompson. There is an understanding, I think, that when you take these steps or do these things in this world, there's going to be a bunch of people who are going to think that you did something noble and heroic, not that you did something that breached every bond of safety and that will create, if we don't nip it in the bud, or that will create a completely anarchic and Hobbesian society in which, we literally came together to form societies and rules in order to prevent moments like Luigi Mangione shooting Brian Thompson in the back. That's like why society exists, so that that's not something that goes unpunished and that you therefore are deterred from doing because of the punishment. What if there's a reward? What if there's a reward instead of a deterrent?
And can I add something to that, which is the quote that you quoted about, I hope the son enjoys the blood money or whatever it was. That that latches onto that by making it, we used to argue over whether the child could be blamed for the sins of the father, whatever. In this instance, the culture is positioning the sin as the father running a health insurance corporation, not the murderer of the healthcare executive, and she's and implying that the children are responsible for the sins of the father, and that thanks to the blood money, this child is now somehow carrying the burden. Not only did his father deserve to die, But the implication is he's tainted. He's tainted by merely being the offspring of a corporate executive. That is an idea that is so extreme, even among very left-wing economic minds and pundits in the
I mean,
U.S.
it's not that extreme. It's very intrinsic to what you might call more primitive societies, right? I mean, I don't believe that the Bible is primitive, but the sins of the father are visited upon the child unto the fourth generation, says the Bible. The idea being that, an evil stain is something that may not even be like praiseworthy. It's just an evil stain. One of the other things that's supposed to keep you from doing evil is the idea that it will haunt your children and your children's children and your children's children's children and be an overshadow their lives. But what if you're Ashley Rojas and you think that being a celebrator of this murder, your children are going to be proud of you. They're going to think
nothing about
you were
these
great
people
for doing it.
I am perfectly comfortable saying these women were steeped in the martyrology around violent criminals, pathological murderers, people who kill cops. I have a whole chapter on it. Leonard Peltier, Mumia Abu-Jamal, Assata Shakur. I mean, these people have buildings named for them on college campuses. There's a whole apparatus, a lattice work around them, an intellectual effort to render their crimes excusable, forgivable, or perhaps having not even happened. Sometimes these mutually exclusive thoughts exist in the same head. And the notion being that they're persecuted by systematic forces. Anything they did, if they did it, is justified by virtue of their revolutionary ethos, their desire to engineer a social reversion, bringing low the people who deserve it and raising up the systematically oppressed, et cetera, so forth. All this nonsense. It's very common. It's totally normalized within far-left discourse. And nobody follows the logic of the conclusion, which would be, and we've seen some of it too within that chapter, Michael Brown, teenager, shot and killed in Ferguson, Missouri, ignited a whole bunch of riots around him. It took a couple of months for Barack Obama's Civil Rights Division of his Justice Department to exonerate Officer Darren Wilson, but not before the mythology around his murder became normalized, generalized. Still probably a lot of people believe hands up, don't shoot is something that was really said.
I was going to say, it generated a catchphrase that's still used today.
Even to a certain extent, George Floyd, who was murdered, according to a jury. But there's literally a movement around him to affix a halo to his head and put wings on his back and make him into a saint. And I'm not being figurative there. There was a literal effort on the part of religious figures who were caught up in the mania of the moment to flatten him, to render him a caricature, an instrument of utility in a political argument. You see it all the time.
So just to you talk about Michael Brown, and indeed in the pages of commentary in the years that you worked here, I think your second piece for commentary was about Michael Brown, and so this was the beginning, sort of the inaugural look at the rise of this excusing of violence, left-wing violence, not the killing of Michael Brown, but the riots that resulted after Michael Brown was shot and killed in Ferguson, Missouri, and then following on into 2016 when the violence became almost explicitly political because it was related to the presidential election, right? A riot in San Jose, California, that was explicitly targeting followers of Donald Trump.
San Jose, Chicago, half a dozen other small cities, one in Arizona.
Yeah. 2017, members of Congress practicing for a softball game, shot Steve Scalise, now the whip of the House. Basically, a miracle that he survived and lived to tell the tale. Guy drives from hundreds of miles to take out Republican politicians that he doesn't like. We have cases that aren't necessarily left-wing violence per se, but are very troubling in the anti-Semitism sphere that I think does, because of Gaza and the way the Gaza war has dovetailed with people like Zoran Mamdani and the encampment people and all of that. We have the effort to burn down the governor's mansion in Pennsylvania, at which Governor Josh Shapiro, an observant Jew, had just held.
Why wouldn't we think that's left-wing violence?
Well, I'm just saying, because you could say that's
perfectly
right.
left-wing.
Okay.
The shibboleths to which he was beholden, the narratives that are embraced by the pro-Hamas 10-7 protesters,
right,
are the same that were advanced by the Soviet Union in the 1960s and 1970s. Elias Rodriguez, who murdered 2 people outside of a Jewish event last year, which also accelerated the publication of this book, actually. That guy was a classic far-left radical with militant elements to his rhetorical approach to politics. There's substantial overlap to a degree that I don't think the two phenomena are separable.
Fair enough. I think it is incumbent on us to acknowledge that anti-Semitic violence in the United States over the past decade has been a ideological, bipartisan affair in which
I think the Pittsburgh synagogue shooter could be fairly classified as racial, ethnically motivated violence, which is the FBI's term of art. It captures a lot of right-wing political violence.
Yeah, and he was against the synagogue's support for immigrants and the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society and stuff like that. So the anti-Semitism of all things actually does bring in both political violent tendencies, which is an issue with anti-Semitism. I'm not excusing the left-wingery of, but these cases I'm bringing up just to say that there has been a steady and persistent drumbeat, and then there are these moments of right-wing violence, January 6th riot, Charlottesville, stuff like that are amplified through megaphones by the media and become like legendary events in American political history. And this steady drumbeat of violence, on left-wing violence for political reasons, is not collated and seen as a threat. In fact, you might say that the Biden administration desperately intended to disentangle the events of left-wing violence, focusing instead on the idea that the political violence in the United States was primarily from the right. That was explicitly a goal or effort of the Biden Justice Department and its its report on political violence in 2022 or 2023, right? Do I have that right?
The school board moms, the school board parents being seen as terrorists versus,
Right.
But
yeah.
Which actually, I have a question for Noah about this. You mentioned some of the political leaders when we first started talking at the top of this hour. Where do you see political leaders absolutely failing in terms of how they talk about this, even well-intentioned ones who want to condemn violence? And how do you see going forward, what role should we expect from our elected officials when these things happen either on the left or the right? But largely, I'm thinking now about the left, where they might actually have sympathies with the political motivations of the attackers, but need to draw a line. Where do you see, are there any examples where you think they've done well? Are there ones that we should actually call out as being pretty terrible?
I mean, my focus is on the terrible. I'm hard pressed in this moment to think of somebody who I think has been exemplary and, a moral paragon. And also, you can't hold individual rhetoricians responsible for the interpretation or misinterpretation of their language by people who are mentally disturbed, especially. So I'm reluctant to draw a straight line, a causal line between, obviously, political rhetoric and political violence. However, responsible communicators should be aware of the elevated nature of the threat environment, the deteriorating threat environment, and the degree to which we're encountering a substantial amount of chatter that is suggestive of a pronounced threat environment. And it's having a pernicious effect on lawmakers' behaviors. They'll admit as much, and I describe it in this book, the degree to which those threats are shifting behavioral patterns and even affecting votes in ways that we should be deeply disturbed by. That is not how American democracy proceeds. That is how it breaks down. To say that there's one person out there who I really admire and who's done a great job on this, I can't even really think of one. And part of the reason why I think
But that's the point, yeah.
part of the reason why I think that is because the Democratic Party has always been attracted to people power. They always find the desirable side of a large street presence. And as a conservative, I'm deeply suspicious of crowds, to say nothing of incipient mobs. But they don't see it that way, and they cultivate relations with them, even in places like Occupy, where if you ask the average occupier, they had no use for Democratic politicians. In fact, they would love to see the party thrown into the sea, but nevertheless, they were fetid with a desire to co-opt that movement and create some, a sense that there was this grassroots enthusiasm and passion that had waned over the course of the arguments around Obamacare. Likewise, 2020, very similarly, embracing the mobs because they were a display of enthusiasm, people power. And as the Republican Party has gravitated more towards the populist camp, they too have found something desirable about the crowds and unruly, perhaps, but nevertheless passionate displays of political enthusiasm in the streets, which is a little different for the Republican Party. But if we have two parties that are agreed that mobs are great, we're going to be in a really bad place very quickly.
No,
we've had polls. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just want to ask Noah about a sort of pet theory of mine here, or not really a theory, a kind of framework, the way I think about it. You've been chronicling left-wing violence for years and years now, and we know it goes back, it goes back to the birth of the left, as we think of it. But I mean, in our time, it goes back decades. So, but it does seem to me that the left's embrace post October 7th of Hamas and jihad and calling for intifada and praising these foreign terrorists, the way it did in the 60s in terms of like paramilitary Marxist groups and Marxist communist armies abroad, that opened the left up to a sort of new range of horrible conduct, not even exclusively pertaining to Jews in Israel. But it opened the range of possibilities because they've now sort of embraced this exotic, foreign, deadly sense of mass killing, celebrated religious violence. And I think if you look at sort of the recent spate of political assassinations or attempted political assassinations, it's kind of all after October 7th, actually.
You mean the Trump assassinations?
The Trump assassination.
Trump assassination, Charlie Cook, even Brian Thompson.
True, but the attempt on Brett Kavanaugh preceded it.
Sure.
And there were a couple others that I'm blocking on, but I can think of that over the course of the 20 years or so that constitutes our current wave of violence. And in the book, I essentially established three waves of left-wing political violence occurring over the course of a half century or so. The 1910s and 1920s socialist anarchist wave, the Marxian guerrilla movements of the 1960s through 80s, and today, beginning in about 1999 and accelerating rapidly after 2010. I didn't write about the international context for this book. It is exclusively within the United States. But I reviewed for commentary a couple of months ago Jason Burke's book, The Revolutionists, which describes the pathway that the international Marxian left took, beginning with their infatuation with Cuban-style Marxism, Foucaultism, and the urban guerrilla movements that were inspired by the Cuban Revolution, and how they transitioned first into pan-Arab nationalists, gravitating towards the Ba'athist socialist model of Iraq and Syria, and then eventually into full-on Islamists after the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran, which incorporated Marxism and Che worship etc., with revolutionary green, not environmentalist, but Islamist, traditional sort of a religious tinged element to what was a revolutionary philosophy, which really enlivened people like Jean-Paul Sartre and others. And you could see that didn't happen in the United States, in part because the United States had a very different relationship with the Islamic Republic of Iran from the outset than, for example, Europe did. But maybe there was a long tail on that. Maybe that evolutionary course that the international left followed over the course of the 60s, 70s, and 80s was just delayed before it got here and has just been an accelerated pathway. Because you can see the same language, as I describe in my book, from Soviet-era efforts to agitate against Zionism, Zionology being a phenomenon in Soviet academe that was just a way to launder anti-Israeli narratives into the broader discourse. And what we hear from the activist class, I mean, it's a precise mirror. So none of this stuff is quite new. Perhaps it was just delayed.
Well, so
can I ask about an element of the ideological aspect of it, which is that we see polls that say left-wingers more likely to excuse political violence or say political violence is justified. We saw a YouGov poll, I think, recently about that. But also that, what concerns me is that those left-wing respondents tend to be younger, right? And now we have, obviously we have, a groundswell of youth populism, if you want to call it that, on the left, but we also have a growing number of people now on the right who, and this is something I don't usually hear from Republicans, but if the kids don't like Israel, so how are you gonna win elections in the future? I guess we just, if the kids say it, the kids must be right. We have to kowtow to the kids, whatever. So my question is, do you see any pattern about, are we in for a storm? Is there a rising violent generation coming up through? And rather than in the past where young people are tempered by the norms of society, if we're seeing those norms erode right in front of our eyes, are they going to be coming up through a system with no guardrails? Are we in danger of, a sort of next generation being violent?
Well, so I'm of two minds on that. One is that there is a pernicious element to what I believe isn't the obscure history of left-wing violence in this country, but a suppressed history of left-wing violence in this country, and the extent to which these narratives are not passed on to the next generation, our experiences are not passed on to the next generation, then the generation that comes after us has no immunity to them. However, those three ghouls outside that Manhattan courthouse shocked the senses, and that we should take appreciation of that too. There is still a taboo around violence. It's real. Institutionalists understand that if embracing political violence is not immoral, it's certainly gauche and impractical. Maybe that's an instrumentalist argument, but I can work with that. The political utility of pointing fingers in this game, to contend that one side is more violent, more of a threat, is to absolve you and your co-partisans of blame for what you implicitly believe is a problem. If you're pointing fingers at somebody and saying, well, you're violent, the implication there is that violence is bad. Again, this is desirable, but it's the sort of thing that needs to be cultivated and explored. You have to say outright, what is the sin here? What is the assault on basic morality and human decency that you're accusing me of, and therefore implicitly saying that it's bad. So I don't want to succumb entirely to despondency, because I don't think this problem is anywhere near as bad as it was in the 1910s and 1920s or 1970s and 1980s. In terms of the scale of the violence, it's really not. It's something we can get our hands around, right, if we are inclined to look at it rationally and to have a proactive approach to it.
I mean, the problem is that scale, with violence, scale matters a lot less than say, other social trends like supporting single-payer healthcare. That scale matters there. If you go there, then you have a sort of left-wing shift. Here, one person can shoot Charlie Kirk. It takes one person with a rifle and a good gun sight to shoot Charlie Kirk. It takes one person on a badly scoped roof and improperly searched roof in Butler, Pennsylvania, to nearly kill former president and the leading candidate for a presidency in the United States in 2024. So the net effect of a world that is more accepting of this violence and more triggering to people who might take their ideas and put them into action, the barrier to entry is very low. The ability to achieve the violent aim is still very high. The barrier is very high. People are trying to do it all the time and they get caught. Someone's on the golf course for Trump and gets caught, or, approaches the White House compound and gets caught. Hundreds of plots are intercepted every year by the FBI and by local law enforcement and all of that. So actually achieving the terrorist aim or the political violent aim is very, very difficult. But in a world that celebrates it, and I would say culturally, for the last 50 years, we have celebrated, particularly at the elite level, the idea that political violence is justified to fight injustice. And I'll just give you two examples of this, one of which is, who is more viewed as more popular or more present, more current, more of a role model in the world? Is it Martin Luther King Jr. or is it Malcolm X? They were polar opposites. Martin Luther King was live within the system, be civilly disobedient against laws that are disruptive, unfair, unjust, but shame the system into change. And Malcolm X is, the system stole us. We're being bamboozled. We're here in America unjustly, and whatever means we think we need to take to get our way are fine. I would say that inarguably in popular culture, this is a Malcolm X culture and not a Martin Luther King culture, though Martin Luther King is, of course, like one of our few secular saints now. Similarly, if you're somebody who studies American history in colleges and universities, so you're at the elite level, you are studying lionizations of Marxist groups, terrorist groups, American terrorist groups. What do you think you read if you read about the 60s and 70s?
Yeah.
Are you
or
reading?
Earlier?
Or
I mean,
earlier.
the popular narrative is that in American history courses, precisely nothing happened in the United States between the Haymarket riots and the Palmer raids, except the degree to which the United States descended into an anti-immigrant fervor. No reason for anti-labor sentiment, no study of the bombing campaigns, the efforts to assassinate heads of state, heads of government in this country, the multiple attempts on the Attorney General's life, the slaughter of clerks and traders in Manhattan in September 1920. None of that is really worth exploration. So nobody understands where it came from and what the nature of that terrorist campaign was. And one of the things that really disturbs me over the course of the last couple of years is watching the degree to which the violent left has begun targeting law enforcement, federal and state and municipal law enforcement. That is a feature across every left-wing militant wave in the 1910s, 20s, 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and today. And it is the sort of thing that presages and heralds, perhaps, something far more radical and far more violent than what even we've already experienced if it follows the trajectory of those two previous waves of militancy.
Right.
Can I ask a question about, because your title, we've been talking a lot about the blood part of the title, but I want to hear a little bit about the progress side, because the point you just made about the history of this, where the ideology sees violence as a means to an end, that has been an extremely clear through line in a lot of progressive and quasi-utopian theorizing. And it's not just academic. It then enlists people to serve as foot soldiers for these missions. And I think the anarchists were a very good example of that in American history. And you're absolutely right. It is not taught well in schools, and it should be. We have disappeared a lot of our more unsavory aspects of American history over the years. So I hope that this does encourage greater study of that. But where do you see progressive ideology, as opposed to liberalism or conservatism, having at its core a kind of acceptance of the idea that sometimes violence is necessary? Or is that just something we tend to superimpose after a violent situation occurs?
Well, listen, the title is literary. There is significant overlap among progressives who are just basically slightly to the left of American liberals, and Marxian revolutionary elements. This is a Venn diagram with a lot of overlap, but not perfect overlap. And the Marxian revolutionary types are those who embrace the poetic romantic zeal of expressions of political enthusiasm that manifest in violence. They want to see radical social reversals, and they think violence is the instrument to get there. And indeed, they have a lot of historical reason to suspect that that is the pathway to achieving their objectives, regardless of what you think of their objectives. The morality of bringing the revolution to America, irrespective. If that's your goal, then engineering a violent confrontation with the symbols of the state between the public, the masses, as they believe them to be still, the hangers-on, the fellow travelers, the dead-enders. They want to engineer that kind of a conflict. So galvanizing acts of violence are designed to foment that kind of movement. They perceive as, again, let's go back to these women. What did she say? The United States must be, in the course of human history, the most acquiescent population that has ever been. We are beset by forces that we should be rebelling against, and yet we are not. It's time for us to wake up. And what would wake us up? Some cataclysmic event, a clarion call to the great oppressed, systemically displaced American population, who will rise up once they understand that victory is achievable. And how is victory achievable? We make the god bleed. We show that there is a chink in the armor. We can demonstrate how rotten this edifice is, and all it needs is a good push to topple over. That's sort of the mentality that I think the revolutionary types, who are not progressives, who are not simply reformers, but are destroyers, that's what they're attracted to, and that's what they think a lot of other people are attracted to too, and would have the courage to say as much if only the conditions were right.
Again, I think what you're describing is something that is almost anathematic to most people who want to live within the 40-yard lines. Like, they want to live ordinary lives and be unmolested by others, by criminals, by people who could want to tax them confiscatorily or whatever, but they're just going along. The issue here is this is a question of the triggering of people who, in other times and in other circumstances, because the society had not tipped so radically intellectually into irresponsible, dangerous, demagogic, and destructive philosophies, would probably themselves have remained inside the 40-yard lines. And you just don't need very many of them. You don't need, it takes one assassin's bullet to take out a president. It takes one guy with the idea of shooting the United Healthcare executive and somehow figuring out where he is on that morning in December to shoot him in the back. Unless every single person in America lives like a Brazilian rich guy surrounded by 4 vehicles every time he drives anywhere, because there's a kidnapping culture in Brazil that is simply a form of, commercial gain. You kidnap somebody to get money and then you release them. But here,
by the way, even then, it takes one person who's willing to give their own life in order to carry it out.
Exactly. And, so the issue here is, and I think it's also fair to say this book, we're making it sound very theoretical, and it is a history of the last. It is a history of left-wing violence that tells a narrative story, and so it's interesting and exciting and full of all sorts of things that you didn't know before that Noah illuminates, and so it's.
I mean, the extent to which the very recent scholarship into some of these periods, that all of them are described by their chroniclers as forgotten for a reason. The forgotten terrorists, the anarchist wave, the forgotten Puerto Rican nationalists who shot up Congress in 1954, the forgotten militants of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, as described by Brian Burroughs in his book. Why is everything forgotten? Is there a reason why we keep forgetting this sort of thing? Is it just trauma that we banish from the national imagination? No, I don't think so.
Because Puerto Rican nationalists tried to kill Harry Truman when he was in office.
Right. Well, that was
Puerto Rican
Harry
nationalism,
Truman
which
and
evolved
Congress,
into the FALN. But there's no symmetry here on the right, duly so, and I'm thankful for it. Every institution in America doesn't need to be goaded into the noble work of scanning the horizon for signs of right-wing violence. They're attuned to that threat, and they should be. And anytime there's an episode that can be plausibly blamed on right-wing political activism manifesting in violence, we're treated to prolonged national lectures about our complacency and why we should address our blind spots. And that is all to the good. But there is no symmetry when it comes to violence from the left. And I don't recall ever encountering a sustained grappling with this phenomenon, even as it's so ripe for exploration and so obviously paramount in our national life. It's the background radiation that we've all begun to get used to. So where is that exploration? And why is it just so, it doesn't seem to capture the imaginations of America's opinion makers and shapers?
Well, it doesn't. Well, this is the ultimate question here, which is, does it fail to capture them, to fail to capture the imagination, because so many people in that world who are the opinion leaders and decision makers have a weird implicit reservoir of sympathy with the aims and goals of the violent people, even if they don't support the violent ends. And therefore, there comes it's terrible that a man is shot on a street on 53rd Street, but our healthcare system is terrible, and he was at the top of it, and sometimes people are just gonna crack.
Or if you're Bernie Sanders, it's not just the healthcare system. In his own estimation, as he said in that quote, it's the electoral system, it's the housing system, it's the banking system. It's broken. Everything is broken.
It's
so
America.
What do we need? Throw it all out.
Right.
Yeah. Can I ask a follow-up on this? Because I'm really interested in, Noah, how you see one aspect of this. A few years ago, Louis Farrakhan was in the news again because, the Nation of Islam leader, because the Women's March leaders were associates of his, and some other people were seen taking. There was a photo surfaced that a couple members of Congress took a photo with him or whatever it was, and there was a concerted effort. Immediately, it was instinctive. It wasn't even organized. It was instinctive by pundits on the left who came in and said, "This guy is right wing, and therefore this is a right-wing hate preacher." Louis Farrakhan. The Washington Post wrote in an article, the right-wing Farrakhan, whatever. I think it was, Adam Serwer at The Atlantic chimed in also, along those lines. There were a few people that were just like, it was bizarre that you could tell this was on the tip. They'd been waiting so long to pass Farrakhan off. And then it was like, well, why is he right wing? Well, he hates gays. So clearly, my question to you is, we're seeing, as you discussed in the review of that book, the revival of something that, I've commented on, how I can't believe how much I've written on the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine since October 2023, the revival of sort of Marxist clearly left-wing Palestinian or pro-Palestinian nationalism or pro-Palestinian anti-Zionism that is clearly left-wing. How do we have this conversation when somebody, an Islamic terrorist tries to shoot up a synagogue in Michigan, and the left does not see this as left-wing in origin or influence at all, and in fact resent the implication that this could possibly be called left-wing violence? So I'm curious to know your point of view on how we have that conversation about the unwillingness, because that is the key issue right now on the left with the campus protests and all that stuff. The one thing bringing it all together is this kind of rabid anti-Zionism, and they refuse to believe that because, Islamists are clearly ultra-conservative. If you read the New York Times, the ultra-conservatives of ISIS. How do we have this conversation under those circumstances?
Well, call it the BS that it is. I mean, that's just trash. And it's intellectually indefensible trash. If you were the notion here being that radical Islamist terrorism in the Wahhabist context, I suppose, is ultra conservative. In the United States, radical Islamist terrorism is revolutionary. It is not conservative. It seeks not to conserve a single thing about the American founding. So we should just toss that one at the outset. It is a rhetorical trap that they're attempting to lure you into, and it is easily negotiable. Walk around it. The notion also that the Women's March was somehow co-opted by ultra-conservative forces and therefore descended into anti-Semitism is similarly bunk. I mean, when the thing was being feted by the likes of Kristen Gillibrand as the suffragettes of our time in Time magazine's profile of the Women's March, its organizers were celebrating the birthday of the, quote, revolutionary Assata Shakur, Black Liberation Army activist who was jailed and then subsequently escaped after participating in the murder of a New Jersey state trooper on the side of the New Jersey Turnpike, who was a revolutionary left-wing activist who lived comfortably until she died last year in Cuba, a fugitive from American justice. And she was a radical left-wing militant. And this organization was radical left-wing and militant, but not nearly enough for those who wanted the individual supporters of this thing. When it was an organic phenomenon, when it was just an expression of anti-Trump anxiety, and was actually a healthy expression of dissent against Donald Trump in March of 2017, it was attacked by its allies for not being violent enough. There was one woman in the New Republic who wrote an essay about the degree to which the police are staying their hands with these white women. And that is an insult to you white women. It is a provocation that you should respond to with far more aggression than you're displaying, because it just suggests that you're on the side of the system. And you should be far more revolutionary than that. This was its organizers, its supporters in the intelligentsia, were hostile to the American Civic Covenant as we understand it. And one expression of that hostility was anti-Jewish animus, which Linda Sarsour evinced, which others within that apparatus.
Tamika Mallory was another. Yeah,
Tamika Mallory. That's who I was trying to think of, who was instrumental in the expurgation, the removal of Jewish activists within that organization. But that's just one element of its hostility to Westernism. This anti-Western theme is a thread across left-wing militant groups, thread across the centuries. Again, throughout this book, there are predictive and indeed prescriptive elements associated that you can see across the century of left-wing violent militancy in the United States, which is part of the reason why I don't think it's very, very well explored, because if you know what you're looking at, you can actually predict and interdict, and nobody wants that.
Well, and I would add that the Women's March is a good example of what you're describing in this book, because there you really did have an outpouring of civic engagement by women who began the whole situation calling themselves Pantsuit Nation because they were Hillary supporters who were disappointed. They were the most normcore people you can
I
imagine.
am sure they don't want to be reminded of that.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But the point was that the people who then do the organizing, the ones who actually want to enlist them in a more radical cause, must experience some frustration because actually most Americans don't want to use violence as a political tool. And so there is, but again, the cultural elite see that as a sexy topic, a thing that, let's push the envelope here. Look at how this is Donald Trump's a fascist. We have to sort of up our own game. And it was sort of heartening, setting aside the anti-Semitism, which was horrifying in that context. It was heartening to see so many of the women, just like the most radical thing they did was knit, slightly inappropriate hats and march around DC. That's how Americans tend to want to protest en masse. And so that has shifted, I think, because those protests are not the kind of thing that an increasingly removed elite want to see to advance their own cause.
No, but even more importantly, so the Women's March represented the first moment. And what happened at the Women's March? A lot of voter registration, a lot of political activism within the 40-yard lines. That was the beginning of the resistance to Trump that was legitimate and led to the 2018 election, which was a romp by Democrats against Republicans, won 40 seats in the House. And the point here is that that was a mass demonstration, peaceful, that led to that had partially led to a positive political result for the side that had demonstrated. But the people that Noah is talking about and that are in this book, that is unsatisfying to them. They don't want to run. They don't want to have a majority in Congress so they can pass better legislation. They're looking to radically redefine the United States of America. And therefore, in some sense, what I'm talking about here, the use of actual political means of the United States to affect gradual change, is worse. It's worse because it accepts the legitimacy of the system and says work within it, and you can work your will if you win the argument, and you do the work to win the argument with people who don't have very strong opinions. And so that's why I get back to the whole point here, which is that left-wing violence and the deployment of left-wing violence and the excuses made for it by left-wing intellectuals and all of that is uniquely bad now because it really does only take a few people to ruin it for everybody or yeah.
I just want to add to this point about what happens on the left, the difference between left-wing violence and right-wing, and why the right is scanning its own horizon for radicals and denouncing them and so on. I think there's something inherently different in the way the left and right approach ideology, in that conservatives, if you get 5 conservatives together, they've all got slightly different ideas. They will some will, be totally libertarian, some will be hawkish, some will be isolationist, they all have these little heresies that they sort of cherish and will argue with other conservatives about. And they're very specific in their ideas. And this isn't even just for, I think, the intellectual class. I think it's sort of like, it has to do with what one sees in one's own life falling apart or one's day-to-day life sort of breaking down and wanting to fix and so on. Whereas on the left liberals, they have a sort of direction that they're in favor of, sort of vector. And they see basically anyone who's kind of, if you're going in that direction, which is system's broken, things are unfair, there's inequity, inequality, social justice, the rich, so on. We know the litany. It's like, it's this sort of cloud that they're generally attached to, and there's not a lot of sort of fine differences. There are, I mean, among certain people who really think about it, of course, but this is why when something like someone will come out and declare themselves a socialist, and then someone on the left or liberal will say, well, I don't think it really means socialism. I think they appreciate the general direction, and the same thing goes for all the globalize the intifada stuff. This isn't what they really mean. They just mean, it just mean they're able to sort of put this fog over it, this cloud that works, that they're comfortable with, that means things are moving in the general direction that they think the movement should go in.
There's a lot of vagaries that folks like to hide behind, especially when they're called out on the specifics of why their respective movements are going in the wrong direction. And I don't, I'm not hiding behind the notion that there's some just ill-defined miasma and we're all just sort of sifting through it, and it's difficult to navigate. When you know how it feels. No, it's not the case. I'm very specific about this. There are 80 pages of notes in this book. I'm desperate to see somebody take my arguments apart, because I understand that there will be an effort to find the fatal flaw in this thing. And when it comes to the right, I do close with the right. And I find the disturbing degree to which they're adopting the left's tactics and sort of its raison d'etre to be really unnerving. They're also talking themselves into the notion that the system is irreparably broken, and that even smart and rational center-right voices are working themselves up into a froth over the banalities of constitutional government. They are adopting a martyrology, as they had around Ashley Babbitt, who is not a victim, who was a perpetrator. They're inverting the roles of victim and perpetrator, as the left so frequently does. They're retailing false flags, as they contend that January 6th was. Again, a very common leftist tactic. The president's pardons of violent January 6th protesters repeated Joe Biden's mistake by flattening these people into a category. Joe Biden ended up pardoning a lot of very violent people in his final days in office. So too has the president, by virtue of creating a category of people into which these individuals fit, not recognizing them as individuals who have done discrete things that merit discrete punishments. Mobs, affinity groups, shock forces, all this stuff, black bloc tactics, all this stuff was once exclusive to the left, no longer. And that's the sort of thing that I hope, after 7 chapters of exploring where the left has gone wrong, you can hold up a mirror to the American right and say, all right, now take a look at this, and isn't this a lovely reflection?
Noah Rothman, your book, Blood and Progress, out today. Everybody go buy it. Very important. Also a great read, important to say. It's not homework. It's a
beach read.
It's compelling and
get it for your dad on Father's Day.
Yeah, absolutely. So great to have you, and good luck. And we'll see who comes after you, and we'll see who celebrates you. So good luck, Noah. And back tomorrow. So for Abe, Seth, and Christine, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.